Hi, I'm Laura Lacey, the Executive Director of the Milken Institute in Asia. I would like to welcome you to the 7th Milken Institute Asia Summit. We're proud partners of the Singapore FinTech Festival. For those of you joining us from Brazil, sejam bem-vindos ao nosso evento. Today's session will focus on the Asia-Brazil connection. The session will be split into two parts. The first will be a fireside chat with Brazil's Minister of the Economy, Paulo Guedes, followed by a panel of top global investors into Brazil. Both sessions will be moderated by Ambassador Cliff Zobel. Now, without further ado, I'd like to pass it on to Cliff. Thank you for moderating the session.
I would like to thank Mike Milken and everyone from the Milken organizations for making this session possible today. I would also like to thank our esteemed guests, the Minister of the Economy, Paulo Guedes, our panelist, Andrea Esteves from BTG, one of the leading banks in Brazil, John Vasky, who is responsible for the Western Hemisphere for Temasek, and Oscar Falgren, who is responsible for Mubadala's significant investment portfolio in Brazil. Thank you all for joining us today. Finally, I'd like to thank everyone who is listening today, and thank you for your interest in Brazil. The minister and each of our panelists will bring a different and important perspective of what is currently happening in Brazil and the prospects for the future. Today, we're going to focus not only on the economy of Brazil, but the issues affecting foreign investments, and hopefully some of our panelists will touch upon the importance of green investing. When President Bolsonaro started his term, he combined 3 ministries into one, making it a super ministry. It was responsible for economic, fiscal, and financial policies of Brazil. Minister Guedes became what is known in Brazil as the first super minister. I've asked each of our panelists to have questions for the minister, and I look forward to moderating an interactive session with our 3 panelists and the minister later in the program. At the end, I'll ask the minister for some closing remarks. Mr. Minister, the IMF has recently acknowledged that the downturn in Brazil will not be as severe as was initially projected, and praised the government's measures to avoid a steeper recession and stabilizing the market. In fact, the initial projection was a decline in GDP of over 9%. Today, it'll be closer to 4%. I particularly liked what you said yesterday, that only analysts in denial do not see a V-shaped recovery. However, the IMF also said speedy implementation of structural reform will be essential to mitigating risks. In addition, another concern is preserving the constitutional expenditure cap, which many people believe is necessary to support both domestic and international markets' confidence in Brazil. Mr. Minister, if you can address these 2 observations and provide other insights into the Brazilian economy, it'll be appreciated. We are all looking forward to your remarks.
Cliff, hello everybody. Brazil really is bouncing back very strongly. The economy is bouncing back very strongly. We created 1 million jobs in the last 4 months. To give you an idea of how significant this is, we'll probably get to the end of the year losing 0 jobs in the formal market. So you see a highly flexible labor market like the American, the US. They lost like 30, 31, 32 million jobs in the same period. Brazil lost a million and little less than 1.5 million, but we recovered already these jobs in 4 months. Like you said, it's a big charge. Brazil had a very explosive dynamics in public spending. So even the example that you gave, that they merged 3 ministers, as a matter of fact, they merged 5 ministers. We used to have 5 ministers. It was labor, it was social security, it was finance, it was planning, and it was industry and commerce. 5 ministers spending $15 billion with 70,000 people. We merged these 5 ministries into one, and we shaved off 1/3. So we have one minister spending 10 billion instead of 5 spending 15 billion. So we made a reform inside and outside. Outside, in the very first year, we concentrated on structural reforms, and we approved of Social Security reform, very expressive. More than $150 billion in the next 10 years, we cut in public spending, removing privileges in the social security structure. We also shaved off another $100 billion in interest payments because we reduced the debt GDP ratio, divesting and paying off to the union, deleveraging public banks and reducing the debt GDP ratio. And finally, we have frozen for 3 years, the very first government that does that. For 3 years, we did not give increase in wage bills for the public officers because basically they received 2-3 times more than the comparative in the private sector. When we were just promoting these structural reforms, Brazil was hit by the pandemics. Hit by the pandemics, we digitalized 64 million Brazilians, low-income people. We created an auxiliary grant that gave them the condition to stay in social distancing for 3, 4, 5 months, 6 months. And we are gradually removing these incentives. So we kept them for 6 months at 600 reales, which is $120. We shaved that already in the last 4 months to $60, to half of what it was at the beginning, because as the economy bounces back, we are removing gradually the layers of protection. So I would say that Brazil really handled relatively well compared with the other economies. We spend about 8% of GDP in this protection, and we bounce it back now to structural reforms.
The steepening yield curve is a concern to many people. In 2021, next year, there's a need to refinance 25% of the government debt. That's an enormous amount. How will that affect the economy, interest rates, and the real? And are you concerned about this potential overhang?
This is a great question. Great question, exactly because as we spend a lot of money this year, 8% of GDP, fighting the war against the pandemics, the big question is exactly what happens next in 21. So we had a great first year, 2019, with the Social Security and the reforms, structural reforms. Then we had a second year, dramatic second year, war against the pandemics. And the big question, and that's why the yield curve steepened a lot, exactly asking, what happens now? What happens now? Are you respecting the spending cap, or are you translating these transitory additional expenditures on health services? Are you translating this and transgressing the spending cap because they cannot be removed? And the answer is not at all. We are back to structural reforms. As we speak, we just approved, the Senate just approved the independent central bank so that transitory increases in sector prices do not become permanent increases and generalized increases in prices. So we approved of, in the Senate, the independent central bank. At the same time, we are approving natural gas. We are sending to the Congress tax reform, administrative reform. So we are back to the trail of structural reforms, and we will respect the spending cap. As soon as we announced that, the president announced that 2 days ago, there was a significant flattening of the long end of the curve. And at the same time, like you question, how are we dealing with the renewal of 25% of the debt in the coming, in the first 4 or 5 months of next year? And I can assure you that half of the rollover is already provisioned because we kept deleveraging the public banks. So I have already on provision more than 100 billion from the NDS. We already transferred central bank profits. This because they are basically our subsidiary in the sense that we own the central bank. When the dollar goes up, central bank has a capital gain in their international reserves holding. And there is a law in Brazil that when they have problems, we transfer funds to the central bank, we capitalize them. And when they have profits, there's no need. A central bank is not there for making profits. So they transfer to the treasury these capital gains. They already transferred 300 billion. We used only 100, so provision 200, 100 billion more from the NDS. The rollover is 600. So months before the rollover, we already provisioned more than half of it. So there will be no problem whatsoever.
Actually, that's great news, and but congratulations first and foremost. I know the independence of the central bank was always a priority of your administration as the finance minister, and that's a great accomplishment after years of trying. Let me go back to, if I might, an issue that is not often in the newspapers, but one that you personally have talked about in private conversations and in conversations with countries that are members of the OECD. Maybe you can take a minute, explain the OECD and why you believe for Brazil it is so important to become a member. The next few weeks might determine the decision-making process for full membership. And I thought this might be a good opportunity to underscore the importance to Brazil of joining the organization.
Certainly. Well, Brazil is one of the 10 largest economies in the world, and Brazil is 120 something in degree of openness. So Brazil did not integrate itself to the global value chains. We remained a closed economy, a big giant, a closed giant. So from the very beginning, we said that we should integrate the Brazilian economy, and immediately we went to Mercosur, our regional partners, and we told them, listen, we must move to OECD. And then we asked for American support also, and began talking to our European partners, saying, listen, we want to go for the best league, for the Champions League. So we need to modernize the Brazilian economy. We need benchmarks for tax reform, administrative reform, opening the economy. So the reason to get there is really to face the challenge of satisfying the requirements. It's like 120 requirements, 130 requirements. Out of the applicants, Brazil in the first place. Brazil already satisfied almost 100 of them. We are ahead of many local regional partners that are trying to get into the OECD membership, and also Eastern European partners that want to join. There is an agreement, Americans and Europeans, that for each one that we put from the American side, there is another European in the other side. And we are ahead of all applicants in terms of satisfying the requirements of modernization. So getting there for us is not only a recognition that we are going modern, but more than that, it's a challenge and also a stimulus to keep integrating more and more to the, it refers to everything, to rules for investment, to regulatory frameworks, to tax agreements. It requires to everything.
I was going to say, for a foreign investor, it's perhaps one of the most important accomplishments because you will ascribe to international standards. When I was the American ambassador to Brazil, and we were always negotiating a tax treaty, always, we never could get it across the finish line because the standards were different. Once you become a member of OECD, those kind of treaties between countries and for investments will be that much easier. So I wish you good luck with joining. Let me, if I might, point out an accomplishment over the last month, and maybe you can comment on whether you think it's sustainable. The month of November, foreign investors in one day invested 4.5 billion into the Brazil stock market. In October, there was almost 8 billion invested in Brazil. The daily inflow has been the highest in the last few months since 2011. Is this something that is sustainable? And why, in your mind, is the investment, foreign investment, increasing so dramatically?
Well, I think it's a recognition to our work in implementing the structural reforms. Like you said, we from the very beginning, we knew that we first had to deliver instead of just going abroad and selling. As a friend, you know that I could have been in New York every month selling Brazil, and I never went. I went once or twice in 2 years because I focused exactly on delivering in Brazil, in implementing the reforms in Brazil. We don't want to repeat the cycle that you go oversell abroad and then you have problems, outflow of money, currency exchange rates, currency flights. It's the other way around now. Instead of just stimulating, we changed the policy mix in Brazil. We used to have an easy fiscal policy and a very tight monetary policy. So we permanently high double-digit interest rates, which is very interesting for arbitrage money, speculation, arbitrage money, financial flows, smart money, and an overvalued exchange rate. So you had interest rates of 10%, 15%, 20%, and the exchange rate against the dollar, 180 to 220. From the very beginning, I said, we're going to change the policy mix. Now it's tight fiscal. Let's put a rein on public spending. Let's put down the interest rate. The equilibrium interest rate went down substantially. It came from 6, 5, 4, 3, 2%. Brazil never had that. In 50 years, Brazil never had 2% interest rates. And correspondingly, the arbitrage money left Brazil. We calculate that was around 70 to 80 billion dollars living off just arbitrage. Getting money abroad at 2% a year, 1%, and now virtually zero, and putting money in Brazil to make double-digit interest rates with financial arbitrage. We don't want that low-quality money. So we put interest rates down. Exchange rate went to 5, 5.5. These arbitrage money left Brazil, around 70 to 80 billion dollars. And the hard money, which is this long horizon money, real investment money, and even the portfolio money to the stock market was on hold. And now they're moving. So even the direct portfolio money to stock markets, and pretty much the direct investments of the multinational companies also flowing in. Brazil is the 4th largest receiver of international investment. Ahead of Brazil only China, US, Singapore, and Brazil. For the last 3 years, Brazil is the 4th largest receiver of direct investment.
So your answer is that you acknowledge it and you believe it will be sustainable. We're going to need to switch to our panel, which I'm sure will be addressing a lot of the issues that we've touched and many others. But I want to make sure in the next section, at some point in time, you can bring up venture investing, which has been also significantly increasing in Brazil. And I'd like to better understand your outlook about the government supporting venture investing and early startup companies. But let's leave that for the second session. Thank you, and we will soon join with our panel.